Hello, everybody. Tonight we are going to talk about Bonnie Steinbock's response to Peter Singer's views on animal welfare. Now, if you recall from the previous lecture, Singer popularized this phrase speciesism, right? Speciesism is the assumption that humans are superior to animals in ways that justify using them in just about every way that we normally use them, whether it's as food, as clothing, racing them in horse races, using them as pets, any other way that we want to use them. Speciesism assumes that that animals have a lower moral status than human beings, and they are, in effect, just our playthings to use as we see fit, right? So, I think, as I mentioned last time, when Singer popularized this phrase in the 1970s, he is being provocative. He's meant to draw parallels to sexism and to racism, which, of course, were hot button issues at the time, as they still are. And what he meant to do with it was to sort of draw a parallel that, hey, in the same way that we all recognize that sexism is inherently wrong and that racism is inherently wrong, we should all understand that speciesism is inherently wrong and unjustified and irrational. And in the same way that we should recognize that that women are equal to men, and that non-white races are equal to white races, we should recognize that animals are equal in most relevant moral ways. Animals are equal to humans, right? And Singer writes books with titles like "Animals Are Equal," right? So now remember from the last lecture that the way in which animals are equal, according to Singer, because obviously human beings and animals are not equal in a lot of ways, right? I can't fly, right? Birds can. I can't fly, and I'll never get over this. I don't have big claws like my cats. So there are lots of differences, obviously, between human beings and animals. But the morally relevant similarity between human beings is the ability to suffer. Singer is a utilitarian, and suffering is the beginning and end of moral consideration. So animals, we all understand, suffer. And since they suffer, they deserve moral consideration. And they deserve moral consideration in a way that is on par, if not totally equal, with human beings, right? This means, of course, that for Singer, most uses, in fact, maybe not even qualify it, maybe we don't have to qualify it, all uses of animals, from food to clothing to anything else we can think of, from dog sledding, all uses of animals is morally wrong. Anything that requires the suffering or the hijacking of the life of an animal for the entertainment or purposes of a human being is seriously morally wrong from Singer's perspective, right? So what we're going to talk about today, what we're going to talk about now, is Bonnie Steinbock's response to Peter Singer's article, and her response to the concept of speciesism. And she has some complex thoughts on it. It should be clear from the start, she's suspicious of it, but she ends up being not entirely against it. She's not entirely opposed to Singer. She thinks that he's seriously wrong and essentially wrong about some stuff. But they actually come down pretty close on how they think that animals ought to be used, right? So let's get some notes clear in case you don't have this from last time or you need a refresher. We're talking now about speciesism. The assumption that humans are superior to animals in a way that justifies using them as food, labor, experimental subjects, etc. And this is intended to draw parallels to sexism and racism. Bonnie Steinbock is suspicious, and she's about to explain why she is suspicious. Or I'm about to explain why she's suspicious. Okay. So, Steinbock starts out by mildly objecting to the parallel drawn between speciesism and sexism and racism. She thinks there's a big difference between speciesism and, for instance, sexism. The big difference is that the moral wrongness of sexism and racism is that it's a well-established fact that if you educate women and if you educate minorities, right, you give them the same access to the same textbooks and the same sort of learning institutions, surprise, surprise, they turn out to be just as intelligent as white men. Much to the chagrin of, people like me, white men. Mm-hmm. I'm not chagrined to play that. But it's just a fact. So as it turns out, a woman properly educated can be just as smart as a white male. Here's where the speciesism, sexism parallels break down. You can't do that with a cow, right? You can't teach a cow. You can teach a cow all you want. It's never going to be as intelligent as a human being, male, female, black, white, whatever, right? What's true of women, what's true of minorities, is not true of cows or apes or shellfish, right? Steinbock is already suspicious that maybe the speciesism analogy is getting something wrong, and she thinks that this points out a fundamental flaw in maybe a fundamental flaw in Singer's thinking. Maybe the moral issue here is with what's wrong with mistreating animals is not about intelligence, right? So what could it be? Well, here's some notes. According to Steinbock, parallels to sexism and racism ignore potentially relevant differences between women and minorities. Who properly educated can be as intelligent as white males. This is not so with cows or apes. So the moral issue here isn't really intelligence. So what is it? What is the moral issue that makes animals and people different? Now, Singer has a very quick and easy answer to this, and Steinbock is going to be suspicious of that as well. So, what's Singer's answer to this? Stay tuned. You should probably be able to guess, but stay tuned. Okay. So we left off asking, what is the if intelligence is not the what decides what is morally significant, then what does? Singer's answer to this ought to be clear. Suffering. He's a utilitarian. That's all that matters. Suffering. So animals suffer, humans suffer. They should be the fact of their suffering should be given equal moral worth, right? Now, Steinbock is suspicious of this. I mean, she recognizes that, of course, suffering is a moral issue. Suffering is bad. We should try to avoid suffering. We should care about people who are suffering, and so on, right? But this is the only moral issue. Aren't there aren't there other moral issues aren't there other things that matter to moral issues? And isn't it natural to consider some other factors? Um, she gives a thought experiment at one point, and she says, "Well, now, imagine a dog that's really hungry and starving to death. It's suffering, right? Now imagine there's also a young child who is also suffering and starving to death. Um, how do we choose who to give a hamburger to, right? Um, what considerations come into play? Do we, I mean, maybe we might consider, well, who's suffering, who's closer to death, who's suffering more. But let's say they're both equally they're both equally starving to death. Do we flip a coin? No, we give the hamburger to the child, right? Um, and this doesn't seem to be a terribly vexing moral issue. In fact, we would question the morality of somebody who would prefer the dog over the child, even if it's your dog, even if you love if it's your family pet and you love your dog, and the child is a stranger to you, it still seems depraved to feed a dog, to value the life of a dog more than the life of a child, right? And yet, this seems to throw a wrench in Singer's calculations. I mean, the suffering of one seems to be equal to the suffering of another, right? So, right here, Steinbock is suspicious that suffering is not the be-all, end-all. It may be one moral consideration and an important moral consideration that we take into that we factor into our decision-making process. But it doesn't seem to be the alpha and the omega that Singer and the utilitarians seem to think it is. What other factors come into play? So, you have the notes here. Singer, the morally relevant issue is suffering. Steinbock argues, however, that suffering is important, but it is not. But is it all that matters to moral issues? Isn't it natural to consider other factors? Now let's talk about what other factors might come into play and what other factors Steinbock thinks are important. So next, Steinbock wants to consider some human capacities that might be morally relevant, might be the sorts of things that we take into consideration whenever we are judging whether or not human interests might outweigh an animal's interests, like whether or not a cat is in your chair. So anyway, Steinbock goes down a list of these. She says, I may as well just hold this up. Human capacities that might be morally relevant. In addition, and these are, of course, in addition to our ability to experience suffering, right? She says, in addition to suffering, there are some things that human beings can do that could be morally relevant. For instance, we are held morally responsible for our actions when we do things that make sense to morally praise or blame us for those things, right? In a way, all of these, of course, are going to distinguish us from animals, right? You don't morally praise or blame a bear, for attacking someone, right? Granted, in a lot of cases, they do end up euthanizing the bear, so maybe that's a bad example. But you don't blame the crows for eating your corn. That's just what crows do, right? We human beings are in a unique position to act fairly or unfairly. We have certain kinds of moral capacities to return favors, right? To somebody does something for you, You to return the favor, do something nice for them. On the contrary, we also can show a lack of respect for somebody or ingratitude for somebody. And if we show ingratitude for somebody who's done us a favor, well then it goes back to we are held responsible for our actions, right? So we all have we all have this kind of natural sense of morality. We all have this kind of natural sense of fairness, right? Furthermore, we can act selflessly, right? We can act out of the kindness of our hearts to help other people in ways that even hurt our own interests. Animals can do this sometimes. Of course, there are, the mother bird might sacrifice herself for the good of her hatchlings, right? But human beings are capable of doing this upon acting selflessly, upon consideration for strangers, not out of a sense of instinct to preserve their own offspring, but out of a sense of understanding. Okay, I recognize that I have a duty to act here, and I must do this, even if it hurts my own interests, right? Related to that, we can act for reasons. We do things for reasons. We can reflect on them, weigh our options, think if I do this, this will happen. If I do this, this will happen. I have options A through D. I choose to do D, right? And furthermore, rather strangely, this is sort of an odd addition, I think, in Steinbock's article, but she points out that human beings have a unique desire for self-respect. We want to decide our own futures. We want to be respected. We don't, for instance, want to be enslaved. And this is an essential characteristic to human beings that is not something that is present, as far as we can tell, in lower animals, right? These capacities, and this is not necessarily an exhaustive list, but these capacities, and maybe more that we can think of, Steinbock thinks makes human beings member of a unique community, a moral community. It makes us members of a moral community, that we are capable of recognizing the value of others, capable of recognizing and fighting for our own value, of recognizing the rights of others and demanding others respect our rights. And this is the essential characteristic of what it means to be part of a moral community. Animals simply do not possess this capacity, right? Just one second. So from Steinbock's perspective, humans have a privileged position in the moral community. And so it is worse to kill or hurt or experiment upon a human than it is upon a rat. This doesn't mean for Steinbock that we have an unlimited ability to injure or harm animals. We should carefully consider what is gained by the experimentation we do on certain animals. We should consider what we get. We should take seriously their pain. We should take seriously suffering. Suffering, she recognizes, is a moral concept. It's not the only moral concept the way that Singer thinks it is, but she recognizes that all things being equal, suffering is a very, very bad thing, and if we can accomplish something without there being without an animal having to suffer, that would be a good thing. So another issue she takes with Singer's argument is Singer argues this way. Singer rejects the idea that since humans have greater intelligence, we have greater moral worth, right? And his argument goes this way. He says, well, there's a huge difference in the intelligence of human beings. Some human beings are very, very intelligent. Some human beings are not so intelligent. We don't think that the very intelligent human beings deserve more moral consideration or have more moral rights, or that it's more wrong to hurt them than it is to harm a less intelligent person. So Singer concludes from this that intelligence is really an irrelevant moral concept, right? And Steinbock takes issue with this. She thinks that it kind of misses the point, that intelligence isn't a contest. There is a certain amount of intelligence that needs to be present for you to be a member of the kind of moral community that she's talking about. There's a certain amount of intelligence that's required for you to recognize the rights of others, and be able to understand the difference between acting fairly and unfairly, and be morally responsible for your actions, and yada 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 and so forth, right? It does, and once you've met that bar, you are now a member of the moral community, and it doesn't make any difference how much smarter you are, right? So it's not a contest for her; it's a prerequisite. Okay. So let's talk a little bit. Let's do a little critical analysis of Steinbock's argument. When I picked this to accompany the Singer article, I was hoping she would kind of come at him a little more. I hope there would be a little more fisticuffs. When in fact she seems to basically agree with a lot of his points, and her rather than this being sort of a point counterpoint, she's really just kind of supplementing a lot of the things a lot of the points that he brought up, right? I mean, they do disagree. They do disagree about suffering being the most important moral concept. I would put her, I think, in the camp of the inherent value camp that I talked about last time. I think Steinbock's article fails a little bit in terms of its scope. I don't know what this article is. I don't know what conclusion we're supposed to reach about whether or not we should eat animals based on this article. I don't know I don't know what, if any, sort of radical changes in our attitudes towards animals that Steinbock is endorsing. And on that note, she seems not nearly the extremist or the firebrand that Singer is. I get the feeling from the tone of her article that she's not particularly a firebrand, and doesn't follow Singer along the lines of wanting to do away with all uses of animals. She certainly thinks that if necessary, we should engage in experiments on animals. So, but an interesting supplement to the to the Singer article. The most interesting thing, I think, that the most interesting part of the Steinbock article happens at the end, in the last couple of pages, and it introduces. I don't think I brought this up the other day, or I didn't call it by name, but this is an extremely important and extremely important topic in this in the animal welfare issue, and it's maybe the most controversial thing that people argue about. So let's talk about that. Okay, so we've talked about a few different philosophical positions that people can take about the issue of animal welfare. We talked about utilitarianism. I think the real issue is suffering. Animals suffer, therefore they consider moral consideration. We talked about the inherent value view, that animals are the experiencing subject of lives, that they have these unique little worldviews, and that the destruction of that is a great tragedy, and it is immoral to enslave that or destroy it. And there's a variety of those. Steinbock ends up endorsing a view of that, saying that there are a variety of mental and moral capacities that human beings have that make us of a different brand or of a different kind of moral thing than animals, right? In a way that may entitle us to use them for our benefit if the benefit is great enough, right? Yeah, the scary the phantom that is haunting this entire debate, and haunting basically every version of philosophical position regarding animal welfare is what's come to be known as the argument for marginal cases, right? And this argument goes this way: that however you cash out, just about any way you cash out, the difference between the moral difference between animals and human beings, whether it's that human beings are more intelligent, whether it's that human beings are members of a moral community that animals can't be part of, even if it has to do with certain kinds of suffering, you have to face this argument that's called the argument for marginal cases, and it goes this way. If lack of intelligence or moral ignorance justifies the use of animals, it also seems to justify the use of infants and severely mentally handicapped people. Right. So, this is a particular issue. It's well regarded as a particular issue for inherent value views. People who want to say that human beings are just inherently better than animals because of our intelligence or because of our membership in the moral community. They then have to face the problem that, well, infants aren't intelligent yet. And they're not members of the moral community in terms of being able to understand the rights of others and respect the rights of others. And yet we still seem to consider them members of the moral community. You can say the same thing with the severely mentally disabled, right? People who have the cognitive ability of an infant. We still think it's a violation of their human rights to, say, experiment on them or abuse them. But why should that be? If we don't consider those same actions to be wrong when done to animals that maybe have as much intelligence as the human beings that we're talking about, right? So this is a particular issue, as I said, for inherent value views. Also comes up with utilitarians. I mean, if a utilitarian thinks that experimenting on a severely mentally handicapped human being who doesn't really have the ability to understand what's happening to him, let's say, and that great medical insight can be gotten from doing this experiment, right? Or consider an infant, right? A newborn baby. We could, by doing experiments on newborn babies, we could, potentially learn all sorts of things about certain kinds of medicine, right? It seems like the utilitarian would be hard pressed to come up with a reason why that's just inherently wrong, right? It seems inherently wrong. It seems wrong, period. Of course, a utilitarian can never say it's inherently wrong. They can never say, well, it's just wrong, period, right? So the argument from marginal cases is kind of the big boogeyman that is haunting the whole animal welfare philosophical literature, and it's a little hard to. It's more than a little hard to deal with. Everybody who writes about animal welfare has to come to terms with this to one degree or another, and some people do it better than others. Steinbock actually has a really interesting and very honest discussion of this at the end of her article, and honest in terms of she doesn't pretend to have any great philosophical insight. She just says, in effect, it's icky, right? The thought of experimenting on mentally handicapped people and on babies, no matter how much we might gain from it, seems so fundamentally wrong and so fundamentally emotionally disturbing that there's got to be a reason why it's wrong. Which is just about the most intellectually honest argument I've heard along these lines. So okay. Well, I guess that's it. The password. It's strange to me. A word about the attendance passwords. It's strange to me that some of you, I'll post like a 45-minute lecture, and within half an hour, people will already be getting back to me with the attendance password. So that leads me to believe, I don't know, there's some sort of technology that's allowing people to cheat. So maybe I will stop saying attendance password and then just give it. And instead I will say, I don't know, something else. What? Rainbow. That's not the attendance password. But rainbow will be the code that will introduce the attendance password. And so rainbow, Kleenex. So Kleenex. Kleenex is the you-know-what that you should email me. So, okay, so don't cheat. I try to construct this class so that you can't cheat, but people still find ways. So, okay. Good night, everybody.